Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special evening of talk and little music as well. My name is Matt Watroba, filling in for the amazing Reggie Harris, who had an accident and hurt his wrist. So he asked me if I would come in and do the opening song for this event. I think I've done three of the Living Legacy pilgrimages as a musical leader. And I was about to do a fourth when it all came crashing down in March. So it is really an absolute pleasure to be back with my colleagues and to be introduced to these amazing speakers who I feel honored to be on the same Zoom with, to be honest with you. At the end of every single day of the pilgrimage, I always tried to think of there would be one song that I wanted to sing after the whole day was through, after we sat in a circle and sort of decompressed all the things we went through. And this song became the song we sang together every night at the end of the evening. And it was a song written by Gil Turner, who was an activist during the movement and a great songwriter and great singer. And it's so easy to sing along. Please do. Please sing with me as you figure this out. Carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. There you have the lyrics. There's a man by my side walking. There's a voice within me talking. There's a word that needs a saying. Carry it on. Carry it on. Try that. Carry it on, carry it on, and they will tell their lion stories, send their dogs to bite our bodies. They will lock us up in prison. Let me hear you. Carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. And when you can't go on any longer, take the hand of your sister and brother. Every victory will bring another. Let me hear you now. Carry it on. Carry it on. One last time. Carry it on. Carry it on.
Friends, please show some love for Mr. Matt Watroba. Thank you, Matt, and good evening and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Carlton E. Smith, an ordained minister in the Unitarian Universalist Association and a grateful member of the Living Legacy Project Board, as well as your host for this hour. I'm with you from my hometown of Holly Springs, Mississippi, birthplace of Ida B. Wells, burial place of Hiram Revels, and home of Rust College, which I understand was known to visiting students as the Club Med of Mississippi during Freedom Summer of 1964. But we'll get into that a bit later. It's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's Living Legacy Project program on pivotal events in the civil rights movement. This evening, I have the pleasure of being in conversation with longtime friends and partners of the Living Legacy Project, both of whom I've had the pleasure to meet on previous pilgrimages when we were on the bus in Jackson and Meridian, Mississippi. Today, our pivotal events are the Freedom Rides and Freedom Summer, and the two people you will hear from this evening each bring very personal perspectives to what you might learn in history books about those events. In 1946, the Supreme Court's Morgan decision had outlawed legally enforced segregation on interstate buses and trains. And in 1955, the Interstate Commerce Commission had mandated that not only segregation on buses and trains end, but the train station waiting rooms, restrooms, and restaurants also be desegregated. These decisions on paper were not being ignored in reality all over, were not being ignored in reality all over the South. In December of 1960, the Supreme Court in Boynton versus Virginia had extended these rules to bus station waiting rooms, restrooms, and restaurants. The clearest way to demonstrate that the laws were being ignored was for groups of Black and white passengers to travel together, sitting anywhere they wanted and using all bus station facilities. Hundreds of people, most of them quite young, participated in the freedom rides, which started in 1961. Some of them were college students who came from outside the South, while others were local to cities like Jackson. All of the freedom riders' lives and health were in danger as they made their way across states, including Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, because white supremacists wanted to punish them with beatings, bombings, and incarceration. Known as the youngest of the freedom riders, Hezekiah Watkins was only 13 years old when he joined the struggle. He became a lifelong advocate for justice after his arrest trying to meet the freedom riders at the Greyhound bus station in Jackson, and ended up on death row at Parchman Farm, the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Since then, his activism has included being arrested over 100 times, and to this day, he remains committed to improving the quality of life and opportunities for all humankind, with special consideration for youth. Often, when the Living Legacy pilgrimage comes to the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, where he works in Jackson, Mr. Watkins brings history to life as he shares with our group and many others. Welcome, Mr. Watkins. We're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, a few years later, after the beginning of the Freedom Rides in 1961, the movement to secure voting rights for Black people in the South was gaining momentum. Organizers with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had organized Freedom Summer, when college students from across the country came down to Mississippi to create educational opportunities for Black people and to help them get the right to vote. Not long after those young adults started arriving in Mississippi, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney from Meridian, Mississippi, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner from New York City, were abducted and murdered in Neshoba County, Mississippi. James Chaney's daughter, Angela Lewis, born 10 days before her father disappeared, grew up and into her father's legacy. In 2005, 41 years after her father was murdered, she saw one of her father's killers finally brought to justice. She is both a longtime nurse and a theological student. In an article in USA Today from a few years back, Ms. Lewis affirmed her desire to help people as part of her legacy, saying, "I love educating young people. And the older I get, the more I realize I'm like my dad." Welcome, Ms. Lewis. We appreciate you and your witness. Now, Mr. Watkins, I would like to begin with a bit of your story from birth up to the point that you were arrested. You were born around the time of the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, led by Bayard Rustin and George Hauser, under the sponsorship of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the fledgling Congress of Racial Equality. That was part of the inspiration for the freedom rides of the 1960s. Who was that young teenager eager to meet the freedom riders who got swept up into the movement? Where did he come from?
Actually, I came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My mother, father lived here in Mississippi, and my father wanted to get away to make a better living for his family. I wasn't born at the time they left Mississippi. I was doing, I guess, the Great Migration period, and he just saw another side of life that he wanted best for his family. So they moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and thereafter I came along. And about 5 years later, my father died. And my mother had to make a decision. Do I stay here in Wisconsin or do I move back to Mississippi? I already had 2 brothers, and now my mother is dealing with 3 boys. So will I be able to manage there, or will I be able to manage best back at home with her parents? And she chose to move to Mississippi. And as I grew and went to school, didn't know anything about nothing, to be honest with you. As a matter of fact, before moving back from Wisconsin, I didn't know anything about nothing. So one day I was in middle school. They called it junior high back during the days. We was hearing, my friend and I, was hearing a lot of activity that was going on in Alabama. And we began to watch the evening news every day because that's where our information was coming from. So in watching the news, those freedom riders, which I knew nothing about, became our heroes and sheroes. Seeing them being beaten, watered down with water hoses, bitten by dogs. All of these things was unnatural to us, but it also was bravery. And we just kept watching the news and kept asking. I recall asking my teacher once about the Freedom Riders, and he told me to never, ever bring that word up in his class again. So, wow, it can't be that bad. You're on TV every day. So one day I asked my mother about the Freedom Riders. Tell me, what are they? What are they here for? What are they doing? And my mom said, we'll talk about it later. And that later was maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. And every time we would have a family discussion, we would always go to the kitchen table. I don't know why we did it, but we did it. So this particular day, we at the kitchen table. He said, you remember you asking me about the Freedom Riders? And I said, yes, ma'am. She said, well, I'm gonna tell you, they really don't mean us no good because I could lose my job. I could lose my life. You could even lose your life. You have to think about your brothers, and it's just not the time for us. It's not the time for the Freedom Riders to do what they are doing in Mississippi. Well, I'm gonna be honest with you. I heard my mother, but I didn't understand a word she was saying. So I said, okay. And I left. I kind of forgot about it. I think it was on a weekend, but that following Monday at 5:30, I'm back on the world news. And they talking about what had happened again. So my friend was right there with me because my friend didn't have a television, but we did. So he would be over there watching the evening shows, and right before the news would come on. So the news came on and we was just staring at the TV, and they was showing their Freedom Riders being beaten and just misused, and we still couldn't understand. So we had a counselor at the school that was very friendly to the students. And I thought, well, I'm gonna catch her alone and then talk to her about the Freedom Riders. And I did. And she looked around and made sure no one was near. She said, they fighting for our equal rights. I said, equal rights? What's equal rights? I have equal rights. She said, no, we don't have equal rights. They are fighting for equal rights. I said, okay. Now I got to find out exactly what equal rights mean, okay? So we began to watch it again. So I forget the man named Chet somebody, think of his last name, but he was a national correspondent for the national news. He said, well, the Freedom Riders going to be leaving Alabama, headed to Mississippi. As we looked at each other, said, man, they coming here. Wow, I got to see them. We'll find out when they're going to get here. So on the local radio station, we would watch or listen to, they stated that the Freedom Rider would be at the Masonic Temple. And we looked at each other and we got on our bicycles and we pedaled over to the Masonic Temple. After getting there, the meeting was over. But the presenter was asking the audience, are there anyone here who would be interested in joining forces with the Freedom Riders? Meet us at the Greyhound bus station. So we looked at each other and kind of nodded, yeah, let's go. So we pedaled to the bus station and we only want to get a look at them now. We just want to look at the Freedom Riders, see how they look, how they dress, how they talk, the whole 9 yards. We just want to, and if I had an opportunity to touch one, man, that would have been fantastic. So we get to the bus station and we look around, there's no cars on the streets, there's nobody moving, there's nothing. So we walking up and down the sidewalk of the bus station and trying to look in. So my friend stated, keep your head in front of you, but cut your eyes over in the station to see if there's anything going on. So I did just that. And we had to go down and come back. And when we was on our way back up by the station, he pushed me inside as a joke. And before I could turn and run out the door, an officer hit me on the shoulder and, what are you doing in here, son?
Okay, I want to pause the story right there. We're gonna get to that part of the story in just a moment. And we got like several questions I wanted to touch on while we're together. So I'm just going to check in with Ms. Lewis. And Ms. Lewis, I just wanted to say we regret that your father was killed during the struggle for equal rights before you had any memories of him. I was wondering if you could share with us a bit of some of the stories that you heard about him as you were growing up and how that informed your life.
Most of the stories that I heard about my dad were told to me by my aunts. And as I got older, somewhere around the age of 17 or 18, I reconnected with my father's mother, my grandmother, and there began my education in my father and his life. Before that, I really wasn't told a whole lot about him, but when I reconnected with my grandma, she would speak of my dad and bring him back to life. And that meant a lot to me. And as people began to realize who I was and that I was James Chaney's daughter, I would meet people that had gone to school with my dad or people that knew him from the neighborhood that he lived in. And they would begin to tell me about my dad. One of the stories that my grandma told me is that she would make a lunch because my dad and his sisters went to the Catholic school. And she said that she would make a lunch for him, but he would always eat his lunch before he made it to school. And it's just, meeting those people along the way that could tell me about my dad. Much of my education about my dad has come from reading books, watching documentaries. But when my grandmother came into my life, he became a real person to me.
That's powerful, and it's just so wonderful to have had that ancestral connection to be able to make him come alive, as you said. Thank you, Ms. Lewis.
Thank you.
And Mr. Watkins, I want to say a word first because you've written a whole book about your experience. And
Yes.
before I want to ask you the next question, I just want to make sure that people know about that and ask you to say a word about the book and then give us a little bit of flavor of like what was going on with regards to your experience from the time that the police officer put his hand on your shoulder. And I'm wondering if you can do it sort of like in a summary way, and we'll put the link so people can get into the details of it when they read the book.
Okay, well, the book name is Pushing Forward. I kind of got the name by my being pushed inside of the bus station. And forward is what I'm still doing now, is going forward with my life, going forward with helping others, and the whole 9 yards of forward. That's
Thank you. And you ended up on death row. I mean, could you just say a word about like what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, what happened
Shocking.
after being arrested for being pushed inside of the bus station, I was asked 2 questions. Number 1, your name. Number 2, your birthplace. And I spoke earlier of my birthplace being Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And when I said that, all hell broke loose because they thought I was a freedom rider. And the police officer who detained me yelled out, "I have another one over here." And I didn't know what he was talking about. I have another one over here. I heard footsteps coming from the other side of the bus station. And those was officers who came to his aid, or I'm not going to say defense because he didn't need no defense, but they came over and put handcuffs on me and set me in a chair and called for a paddy wagon. The paddy wagon came and I was taken directly from the bus station to Parchman Prison. I didn't know anything about the prison system, had never seen the inside of a jail other than what I saw on TV. When I arrived there, Parchman, it reminded me of maybe a college campus somewhat, because I never witnessed anything like this before in my life, with the barbed wire fence up, tall buildings, guardhouses. It didn't mean anything to me. Only thing I knew, I was in new territory. And I was put in a cell with other criminals who was there for murder, who had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. And the next morning, after awakening, they began to interrogate me, saying, they called me Little Blood. Little Blood, why are you here? And I said, I don't know, I didn't do anything. He said, yeah, all of us around here, none of us did anything. Then they asked me, said, do you know where you are? I said, no. They said, you in Parchman Prison. Never heard of Parchman Prison. I said, where is that? He said, it's in Mississippi, and you getting ready to die. I said, die? For what? He said, I don't know what you did. You killed somebody, didn't you? I said, no, I didn't. Well, why are you here? I don't know. So they went through all of these things about my raping a white woman could be the reason why I was there, or you did something to a white man. It came with all kinds of reasons why I was on death row. And it just became, I became so nervous, and I just began to regurgitate all day and just couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't do anything. It was a trying time for me to be there. even reflect about Parchment today. Those memories are still there. The hurt is still there. Some of the things that happened to me is still with me, that will never go away. But the main thing about it is I'm alive. And what can I say on that? I'm alive and I'm thankful.
And we are too, Mr. Watkins. And I'm just so sorry. I know that it was a harrowing experience for you to be there, and your rights, your human rights were not respected all during that experience. And I'm just so glad that you survived that and that you're able to be with us today. And we just really appreciate you. Ms. Lewis, you and I are about the same age, except you were born in the summer of 1964 and I was born in the fall. My father, like yours, was active during the civil rights era and also a target. He was among those who didn't really talk about what he and his cohort had experienced back then, because they didn't want us as a new generation to hold hatred in our hearts for white people. They hoped with the gains that they had won, all that hardship and loss could be kept in the past. But we see now that nothing is further from the truth, and the past, which was never really gone, is back with a vengeance. Growing up as you did in the shadow of your father's legacy, what were you taught about the civil rights era, and how did your elders protect you from what I imagine could have been a very frightening childhood?
Most of what I learned, of course, being in a Black family, we were told some of the stories about the civil rights struggle, but I think my experience may have been a bit much like yours. And I think that my relatives thought that it was a measure of protection as well. But being on this side and able to be an elder, I understand how important the history is, that we know about those that bled, died, marched, cried, were beaten, and were put in jail for us to have some of the freedoms that we have today. I do understand also that there had to be a level of protection around my life just because of who my father was. My grandmother ended up leaving Mississippi because she received so many death threats. And I remember her telling me once that she got a phone call when she moved to New York, that the caller said that as long as my dad's body was in Mississippi, he would not be at peace, and that his bones would be strewn all over Mississippi. I can only imagine now. I didn't understand it earlier in my life, but I can only imagine the level of fear that my mother must have had to live with, having James Chaney's child. And to my mother's dying day, my mom passed in 2011. My mother never told me anything about my father. She never spoke of him. And but the funny thing is, she spoke about him to my daughter. And other than my daughter, she is the only person that I know that my mom spoke of about my dad. So much of my education and what I was taught was from reading, from my aunts. And then I mentioned earlier about people that my dad maybe had gone to school with or had known him. They came into my life later in my life because nobody knew who I was.
Mm. I can understand like why your grandmother would want it to have sheltered you. And it's interesting how sometimes that knowledge passes over one generation and then
Yes.
is given to the next. Mr. Watkins, I was wondering how your activism shifted as you got deeper into your teenage years. I know that you actually became a freedom rider yourself.
Yes, it was a year later. After getting out of Parchman, my mother beat the hell out of me. And based on my disobeying her was the reason why and I'm gonna say it again, beaten, not whipped, beaten. I was told not to leave the house, along with some other things, but I did, thinking that I could get back home before my mom made it home. But being 13 years of age and very inquisitive, so I'm being a 13-year-old. But thereafter, I met this man named James Bevel, who was one of the core and snake organizer, who began to show me the way, tell me things that was going on that was not right. And I saw for myself, it was right there in front of me, but I just couldn't see it. And after I saw the light, I began to beg my mother, and she would not give an inch. So James Bevel, not knowing at the time, was a minister, not like you, but he was what you call a bootleg minister. He could sing and he could preach. And my mom was a religious fanatic. And James found that information out, befriended my mother, and began to go to church with us on Sunday. And one day he asked the pastor, could he deliver the message? And the pastor said yes. And he got up and preached and sang. And when it was over, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And on the way home, my mama told James, if you take care of my son, I'm gonna let him go with you. And we said, okay. And the first order of business, should I say, was a store by the name of A&P, who was the store sitting in the middle of a black-white community borderline. And they didn't have any Black employees working there. James and I went to the store, asked for the manager. The manager came. James, of course, did all the talking, and he wanted to know why there wasn't any Black employees here. And the manager stated, the reason I don't have any because they can't count. And, I was just furious over those words. So James and I, along with 4 others, set up a peaceful protest or a demonstration with our signs around the store, and was arrested that Saturday, taken to jail, let out on that Monday. And we went back to the drawing board and came up with another plan. And that plan would be to get more involved. So that was my job, to get some of my associates to come aboard, and I was able to do so. Okay. And by doing so, we had about 30 the following Saturday. Mm-hmm. And what we did, we sent 5 out at a time. The police would come and arrest those 5. Before they could pull off the lot, we had 5 more out there. We did it again. So the lot became filled with onlookers. So that Saturday, there was so many onlookers in the parking lot that they really didn't do any business. And that following week, the manager came looking for us and told James, if you bring me 3, I will hire them. So we got 3 females with no cashier experience, and they went to work, and they was able to count. And I knew then, when that happened, I knew the power that we had. I knew what we could do by sticking together, about boycotting, by putting on some type of demonstration of something. And I was all out there by then.
Yeah, so you must.
It was go.
So you were just hooked at that point, I can imagine. And before we bounce it over to Ms. Lewis, I just want to let everybody know that we actually had Shavara Oren as one of our guest speakers just a few months back. And she is James Bevel's daughter, one of his daughters. He has many children, had many children. She was also learning more about his history as well, and the influence that he had on Fannie Lou Hamer, because he preached at a service that she heard him, and that's how she got activated, was through James Bevel also. So we
I'm
honor
not to
his
cut you
legacy
off,
and
but
his
I'm
memory as
glad
well.
to hear you. I'm glad to hear you say that, because actually James Bevel discovered Fannie Lou. And everybody want to take credit for doing this, but it was James Bevel who did that.
Yes, thank you for that. And what a discovery. I mean, I keep saying to people, it's like she really changed American history through her involvement, but it wasn't her alone, right? It was all of these people who were working in concert, and some people we won't even ever know. I want to have a question for both of you, Ms. Lewis and Mr. Watkins. There's a point where your two stories converge. Mr. Watkins, you were part of Freedom Summer as a Mississippian, just like James Chaney, Ms. Lewis's father. There were many young people involved, both from outside the state and from within it. I'm wondering what you remember of Mr. Watkins, of Mr. Chaney's and his death, and how that impacted those of you who were involved in Freedom Summer.
I never did get a chance to meet Mr. Chaney, and I'm very sorry that I did not meet him. During the time he was missing, I was in Greenville, Mississippi, and we got the call that the 3 civil rights workers was missing, and we all was ordered to Jackson. And we left the Delta, which was Greenville, and went directly to Jackson, and we stayed there, until there was a discovery.
Okay. So you didn't have a chance to, but definitely knew of the story.
I'm sorry.
No problem. Mr. Watkins, I'm wondering if you have a question for Ms. Lewis. I know this is the first time that the two of you are having a chance to meet each other. And likewise, I wonder, Ms. Lewis, if you have a question for Mr. Watkins.
Well, I have a statement, if I may. I'm just sorry about what happened to your father. And I'm equally as sorry that it took you so long to understand what he stood for, what he went through, and the things that he did. Not only was he here, he was also out, so I'm told, out of state of Mississippi, recruiting individuals to come in to help with Freedom Summer, to help with the voter registration, to help with some type of academic activity for the kids. All of this was told to me upon his missing, because I want to know who is James Chaney, because if you don't know everyone, you know their names. And I had never heard his name before. And I was told the time that I was in Meridian, in that area, he was out of state recruiting. And I'm sorry that I missed him. And I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am.
Thank you.
I
I just need to say, I was 10 days old when my father was murdered. During the time that I was born, my dad was at Western University, which is now Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. He was there training the students. They were actually going to come down for Freedom Summer. So when he got back, he went to investigate the burning of the church in Philadelphia and never made it back to Meridian. So my dad never saw me. And I always tell people, other than pictures, I have never seen my dad. And it's okay with me because I know him. I know him. And I know that a part of him is so much alive in me. And I would like to ask, what would you say to young people, and especially young Black males, about being using their life to be of service, seeing the climate that we're living in now, where we're still fighting and marching for the same things that we were fighting and marching for in the 60s? What would be your message, particularly for young men, but for young people, about forgetting themselves, but really choosing to use their life for good?
The first thing I would tell them is pull their pants up. Look like a man, be a man. That would be the first thing. Then I would go into, and I do this on a regular basis, I would go into the spiel about our great leaders. And I use your father name as an example of one who was out there, who lost his life trying to make things better for us, for me, for you. Now things has gotten somewhat better. What are you doing with it? No, life is short. Are you going to try to make a mark somewhere? Are you just going to go with the flow? Now, leaders are born and leaders are made. Either you can be born a leader or you can make yourself a leader. But you will never be another Jane Chaney. You will never be another Martin or Fannie Lou. But you can make your own mark yourself. And I tell them, you can start within your community. You can start at your church. Most importantly, you can start at your school, where you have more surrounding you. Just go in and do something out of the ordinary, like pick up debris on the grounds, or do something for the elderly. If you start off, I'm willing to bet you that you're gonna find, if you have any friends, I'm quite sure you do, you're gonna find your friends coming along with you. That's my spiel to young folks. I use that every day. I'm not sure whether or not it's working, but like I said, I tell them this on a daily basis.
Well, they'll have a chance to hear it once again, once they hear this recording. And I encourage everyone, once the recording is up, to share it with young folks, male, female, and otherwise, and we will appreciate that. Ms. Lewis, I had a question for you in this regard. I think most, if not all, of our Living Legacy pilgrimage participants have encountered you on that quiet country road at the cemetery of Okatibbe, is that how it's pronounced? Okatibbe Missionary Baptist Church in Meridian. I remember you're saying that there have been incidents of vandalism there over the years. In more recent years, we have seen vandalism and the removal of monuments to the Confederacy and slave owners and traders as well, not just here in the States, but also abroad. What goes through your mind when you think about the removal of those statues while we seek to preserve those of true patriots like your father from desecration?
I know a lot of people that have a connection to those statutes. And then some people whose hearts are just filled with hatred and want those statues there to inflict pain. There are those people. But then when you want to look at things in a holistic view and you consider everybody and not just some, you have to look at the other side and realize that those statues represent pain. And I don't want them destroyed because, like it or not, that's part of the history of this country. But I don't think that they need to be displayed in a way that people that were hurt by that era and by those particular people should have to look back and see those people applauded and lifted up. Put them in a museum, somewhere where they can be studied, because we need to realize the relevance of what these people did and the impact that they have on history and on our future going forward. But to leave them there is like asking a woman to walk by her rapist every day and be okay with it, asking a child to lift up and applaud their abuser. There's a lot of pain there. And so that's why I don't want to see them the way that they're displayed.
Mhm. I appreciate your response to that. And that's really a powerful segue into this question I have for Mr. Watkins. Mr. Watkins, we know that the detention of children crossing from the border from Mexico into the United States is a humanitarian crisis that has gone largely unaddressed. Now, your own treatment in the prison system in Mississippi and by that system was nothing short of criminal. Thankfully, you were released after some days, but now those detained children have been away from their families for many months, and for some now into years, I believe. Having had your own childhood experience of incarceration, how do you imagine we can get them free, and what will they need once they are released to their families?
They're going to need counseling, of course. It's just hard to imagine. I saw on the news, I think it was Friday, I think this young boy was 6 years old, and he had crossed the border alone. And now he was being detained. So, I can't imagine what is going through his head, not knowing the next step, the next move, even the next meal. My heart just go out to them. And I know you're in a situation that you want your child to have a better life. So you send him or her, across the border to just do that. But I don't know. The situation is somewhat different from mine, because the families are encouraging or sending these children across the border. All of my children are grown, but I do have grandkids. And my youngest grandkid is 10 and that live with us. I can't see myself sending him to a place of unknown. But like I said, it's a different situation. It's a different time. And I really don't know what I would do, but I would want to save his life. So if that means saving his life by sending him away, then I guess I will be guilty as well. Because I have this thing about, mess with me, but don't mess with my family.
Mm-hmm.
So I would do whatever I had to do to protect my family. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think it speaks to, as you were mentioning, that just the desperation of those parents and those families to get their children to some place where they would be hopefully safer. But as we've seen, that hasn't played out that way all the time. And another sort of recent thing that's going on that I wanted to touch bases on, just a few days ago, Georgia State Representative Park Cannon was arrested by police for disturbing the peace while peacefully protesting outside the office of Governor Brian Kemp, as he signed new legislation clearly intended to further suppress the voting power of Black, Indigenous people of color, and other marginalized groups, thereby preventing future successful campaigns like the ones that Stacey Abrams and other activists and advocates were able to mount leading up to the 2020 elections. I've gotten to know Park a little through our shared affiliation with the LGBTQ Victory Fund, and hopefully she will be one of our guests here or on a pilgrimage in the future. She's carrying on the legacy of John Lewis, who of course was among the freedom riders in the 1960s, long before being elected to Congress. Ms. Lewis, as you think back to the voting rights that your father, James Chaney, gave his life for, and how within a generation or so those hard-won gains were undone by the Supreme Court, where do you see the opportunity to make lasting change?
By doing exactly what we saw Hart Cannon do. She is the modern day freedom rider. Um, Now you don't need the white hoods, the night terrorists, because they are in our Senate, state representatives, governors, mayors. And we have to look at what she did this week and do likewise. We still have to stand up, show up, even if it takes knocking on the door of the governor. Now, she had access because of her position, and not all of us have that type of access, but we do have a voice. We can protest, we can make our voices heard. And that's just the way that I see her today. When she knocked on that door, she was a modern day freedom rider. She showed up.
and showed out.
Yes.
Yeah, I have such admiration and respect for her. And as I've said, to others, it's like we are not going back to 1963. It will never happen. I say that part, and I'm sure that you all and others on this call are in agreement with that. This we're not going in reverse here. Ms. Lewis, I had a second question for you as well. We know that you were at the 2005 trial of Edgar Ray Killen, one of the assassins who took your father's life, as well as those of Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. What did it mean for you and your family to finally get a conviction and at least some portion of justice after all of those years? And are you still in touch with the Schwerner and Goodman families now?
I see them on occasion when there are events. Uh, that's pretty much the level of contact that we have. But when I am in their presence, there is just a mutual respect and admiration for each other. Both of those families have been very warm and loving to me.
And how was it for you in 2005, just knowing that at least one of the assassins had been brought to justice?
I remember the day that the verdict came down. I was in my home with my grandmother, my dad's mom. I work nights, so I'm usually asleep in the daytime. That particular day, I was awake, and I remember watching the news and hearing the verdict, and I screamed, and I ran downstairs and I grabbed my grandmother, and she was speechless. She was crying, and I just hugged her and I hugged her. And I just remember how happy I was that she was alive to see this day, that somebody was held accountable. Although there should have been a lot of somebodies held accountable, but the fact that she got to see some measure of justice is immeasurable for us.
Mhm. What a blessing that she was able to see that day. I'm grateful just even knowing that. And I've got a last question for you both as you think about your children and grandchildren. And Ms. Lewis, I know you have a very young grandchild who was just recently born. You think about that and the legacies of Freedom Summer and the Freedom Rides. What keeps you up at night and what gives you hope?
For me, and I believe any Black mother with a Black son, there are always concerns. I have three Black sons and I have grandsons. I'm concerned, to be honest with you, every time that they leave the house. And not only for my sons, but for my daughter and my granddaughters as well. What gives me a lot of hope is that I see that we're not letting up on what we believe should be right, equal, and just, and that there are those that are continuing the fight of Dr. King, of my dad, and of all those countless others that marched and lost their lives, but their names are never mentioned. The fact that we have young people, as well as those that are still with us that were involved in the civil rights movement, that are continuing to say, we want justice and we want equality, and we won't stop until we get it.
Yes, yes, indeed. And Mr. Watkins?
Well, I have kids. I have 2 boys and 1 girl, 3 grandkids. One of my grands is all 3 of my grands are boys. I'm concerned about their well-being growing up and what they will become. I too am somewhat, I guess, hesitant when they are out at night, not knowing whether or not they're gonna come home safe, especially driving, whether they're gonna be detained. And I have one son who's kind of forceful. I use that word. And I would hate that he get pulled over and he will obey the command, but he's the type of child who's not going to be mistreated. He's going to obey the officer, what I'm saying. But if the officer get out of line, then they're going to have some trouble. And I worry about that. And on Ms. Lewis stated earlier about the Freedom Riders who was there in the 60s, who was out fighting for us. Every day, I talk about that. I talk about the one who are not known, the ones that have not been talked about, the one names are not on the panel. They was equally as important as all of us. I recall when they was looking for your father, they was dragging all of the rivers and lakes and things, and they dug up 2 bodies that wasn't your father's. And it was just saddening to hear that these men had been missing. And I'm told that the officer or the police officers had made a statement that they was in Chicago, but they had been murdered and dumped in a river. We want to just make sure that we don't go back to that type of level that we was in 1960, like fire ants. Racism will be here after I'm gone, and probably you guys as well, because I see racism being lifted. And when I mean lifted, maybe 100 years from now, or even after then, it's gonna go back just like fire ants. Fire ants goes down and they can stay underground forever. But when they see some fresh soil or whatever, they will come up. And I guess I'm allowed to say this, but if not, I'm going to say it anyway. Trump was able to bring those fire ants from under the ground. And we come to find out, we used to think that those fire ants was only in the South. But when Trump took office, we found out that it was everywhere. They always have been everywhere. And Ms. Lewis, like you stated earlier, and I agree, they are the ones who put the judge uniform on, who put the police uniform on. They are bankers, they are lawyers, they are doctors, but they was wearing the hood then. They was trying to protect themselves. Now they don't have to. It's all out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to just make sure that we stay afloat at all times. Be very, very aware of what is happening. If we don't, then we're gonna end up in 1961.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, there are ants all over the globe. I've had a chance to head out of the country. I know you all too have on different occasions, and it's a global phenomenon, these struggles that we're against. But yes, we'll continue to have hope, and often we have hope in our Living Legacy Project work through music. And I have a very final request for Ms. Lewis, who's been blessed with a beautiful singing voice. There's so many troubles in our land and around the world, and one of the reasons people appreciate what we do with Living Legacy Project is that they know they're going to see and hear and otherwise experience something that moves and inspires them. And so I was wondering if you would be so kind, as you've done for us before when we've been out on the road in Meridian, to share with us in song.
Absolutely. This song is, I always preface it by saying this. It's one that I learned as a young girl in church, but it speaks volumes to those that are willing to be beat, to march, to go to jail, and to stand up for those that do not have a voice. If I can help somebody as I travel along, and if I can cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I can show somebody they are traveling wrong, yes, then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. Oh, if I can help somebody as I travel along. Thank you, Lord. then my living shall not be in vain. Thank you, Lord.
Ms. Lewis, thank you so much for closing us out so beautifully with that song. And may we all have that testimony, because we all have an opportunity to help and to be a blessing to someone else. As Dr. King said, we can all be leaders. We can all be band leaders or drum majors for peace is how he put it. So thank you so much for sharing so wonderfully with us. And thank you both, Angela Lewis and Mr. Hezekiah Watkins, for sharing with us so generously today. We were just so blessed to have you with us. Mr. Watkins' book is entitled Falling Forward, correct? Or Pushing Forward?
Pushing forward.
Pushing Forward,
Pushing forward, yes.
Pushing Forward, yes. And so you can check that out and you can Google it and buy that book. I also want to extend thanks to Annette Marquis, our administrator for the Living Legacy Project, who's been our tech in the background, Pam Zappardino, who's been hosting our chat. And I hope Ms. Lewis and Mr. Watkins, that you'll check out the chat and see all the love that's being shown for you there. Matt Watroba, who started us off with that great song at the very beginning, my fellow members of the Living Legacy Project Board and the founders of the LLP. And we thank each of you on this Zoom as well for the privilege of your time. We aim to have a recording of this program on our website by the end of the week. Please visit uulivinglegacy.org for that and other recordings and resources. And we invite you to join us for our next music program, Protest Music, Songs of Action, April 13th, starting at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 5 Mountain, 6 Central, and 7 to 8:30 in the Eastern Time Zone. Our musicians will be Holly Neer, our beloved Reggie Harris, and Matt Watroba, whom we heard from at the beginning of this program. Also, our next speaker program will be the Selma Voting Rights Movement. That's Sunday, April 25th, from 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time to 6:30 p.m. Our speaker will be Ms. Joanne Bland, who is a longtime friend of the Living Legacy Project and was quite active during that time period as a youth. You can register for both of those at uulivinglegacy.org. We will close with a paraphrased quote from Fannie Lou Hamer of Ruleville, Mississippi, one of the great leaders of Freedom Summer 1964. When we liberate ourselves, we liberate others. If we don't speak out, ain't nobody gonna speak out for us. Depart in peace, assured that love surrounds you everywhere you may go. Thank you all for being with us. It's been a wonderful time. And thank you again, Ms. Lewis and Mr. Watkins. We appreciate you all so much.
There is
Thank you.
wild applause in the chat box.
Wild chatty hearts. Thank you. Wonderful stories. Hearts. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. A deep appreciation. Gratitude, love, and hope. Indeed. Love and blessings. Good night, everyone.
Good night.